I'm attorney Phil Giacino, and this is Finding Common Ground here on Altice. You can see this show every Saturday at 10 a.m. on channel 115. Got a great show planned for today. We're going to talk about the 1860 Republican National Convention, the one that ended up with President Lincoln being nominated. At the time, he was Abraham Lincoln, a candidate for the presidency of the United States, 1860. We also have some frequently asked legal questions that we're going to cover, some criminal law questions, and then we're going to talk a little bit about free speech, the First Amendment to the United States Constitution. In this election year, freedom of speech is extremely important. It's important every year, but especially with this election, with what's happening in the world, in America, overseas, free speech is the bedrock of the American Constitution. That's why the Bill of Rights, which is the first 10 amendments to the Constitution, has it as number one. Right? The right to bear arms is the second amendment to the Constitution, but the First Amendment, enacted 3 years after the Constitution came into being, talks about freedom of speech, freedom of religion, freedom of the press, right to peaceably assemble, and to redress the government, to file a petition against the government to redress grievances. So let's get to it. We all know who Abraham Lincoln is. The 16th president of the United States, arguably, according to historians, and in my book, the best president, the best American president in the history of the country. Certainly everybody's top three list. You could debate, Reagan, Jefferson, Washington. Abraham Lincoln is arguably the best president that America has ever seen. He kept the country together during the Civil War and freed the slaves, probably his biggest accomplishment, in addition to keeping the country together, freed the slaves. And I always like to put this in. He did it without one Democrat vote. He had to use shenanigans, but he got the Congress and the Senate to pass the 13th Amendment, which freed the slaves. But what I'm going to tell you now is probably not something that most of you know about. It's a little bit obscure. Now, we all think of him as a great president. There's a memorial in Washington, D.C. Every state has monuments to him. I know Stony Brook, they have a little plaque. I like to see a man proud of the place in which he lives. I like to see a man live so that his place is proud of him. Stony Brook, right near the post office, it says that. Great president. In 1860, there was a primary, just like there is going on now between Biden and Bloomberg, and Buttigieg recently dropped out, and you have Bernie Sanders, and waiting in the wings on the Republican side is President Trump. So these conventions are very important because they end up with who is going to run for the presidency. And in our system, it's Republican and Democrat. We have lesser candidates running, but for the most part, we have the Green Party and the Independence Party, but for the most part, it's the Republicans and the Democrats. So in 1860 in Chicago, Illinois, in a venue called the Wigwam, that's what it was called, the candidates met. And at that time, William Seward, who was the governor from New York, he was in the lead. He had the most, he was a candidate in the lead, and he had the most delegates. And at that time, Lincoln was number two. And then you had Governor Chase from Ohio. You had Ed Bates from Missouri. You had Senator Cameron from Pennsylvania. So those are the guys who were hoping to get the nomination. Seward was the odds-on favorite. And if you know the name Seward, later on in 1867, he purchased from the Russians Alaska and became known as Seward's Folly, or the Icebox Folly. And when they struck gold there, he was a hero. But at the time, he was the presumptive candidate who was going to go on to run as a Republican for the presidency. And he wasn't the first one. John Charles Fremont was the first Republican. But Lincoln ultimately won and became the first Republican to win the office as a Republican. So they have the first ballot. And Seward comes out as number one. Lincoln a close second, Chase, Bates, and Cameron. But he didn't get the majority. So this, you heard of like a brokered convention or a contested convention. This was a contested convention. because the head guy did not have a majority. So they had a second ballot. And right before the second ballot, Cameron, who had no chance, he was like number 5, he gave his delegates, so he gave them the okay to go to Lincoln. So with these delegates now, Lincoln was closer to Seward, basically a tie. But neither one had the majority. So now after a second ballot, they do not have a Republican candidate. So what do? They go to a third ballot. In smoke-filled back rooms, deals are made, and Chase, Bates, because Cameron already had given his delegates, those delegates moved to Lincoln. So Seward kept his delegates, but with those delegates, Lincoln was able to procure the nomination on the third ballot. Again, that's not something you're taught in high school or college even, unless you're maybe a history major. But he secured the nomination on the third ballot, and he went on to win the presidency, and the rest is history. Now, what's interesting is his vice president, and they did, nowadays, whoever gets the nomination gets to handpick who he wants as his VP. There may be some deals going on, but for the most part, it's his call. Back then, they did it differently. They had ballots, just like they had for the presidential candidate. They had them for the vice presidential candidate. Hannibal Hamlin won on the second ballot. What's interesting is he beat a Kentuckian named Cassius Clay. The reason why I say interesting, that is Muhammad Ali's real name, Cassius Clay. He picked the name Muhammad Ali, but Cassius Clay was his name. So Hannibal Hamlin beat Cassius Clay, sounds like a fight, beat Cassius Clay to become the nominee. He went on to win, and he served the first term, the first 4 years, with Lincoln as his vice president. What's interesting is in 1864, Lincoln got rid of, and I don't know the backstory, but Hannibal Hamlin was replaced by Andrew Johnson. And we're more familiar with Andrew Johnson because he became president when Lincoln was assassinated. That's why when you say, Johnson was his VP, yes, in the second term. The first term was Hannibal Hamlin. Had he been on the second term, we'd have a president, Hannibal Hamlin, when on April 14, Lincoln was assassinated. So what's also interesting is that Lincoln was assassinated April 14, right, 1865. He died the next day on April 15. The Civil War ended on April 9th, 1865. Not that many days before Lincoln was assassinated. So he saw the end of the war when Lee surrendered to Grant at Appomattox Courthouse. He got off his horse Traveler and he went in and he presented his sword and he surrendered to Grant. What's interesting is that Appomattox Courthouse, which is a town, you think it's a courthouse, but it's a town. And the guy who owned the house, the name escapes me, but the man who owned the house had moved there because the beginning of the Civil War, he lived where the Civil War started. So for him, it had gone full circle. 1861, now it's 1865, and he's back in the same spot. But now he gets to see history. So John Wilkes Booth, who assassinated Lincoln, the plot was to kidnap Lincoln so that the South would rise again. And even though they surrendered, or even though Lee surrendered, they still had their troops. They were allowed to leave with their weapons. And he was hoping, delusional, but he was hoping that the South would rise. The plans changed. He ended up assassinating Lincoln at Ford's Theater. And he was ultimately killed himself by a Union soldier. And it didn't work. The South did not rise. Andrew Johnson became president, and the rest is history. He followed what Lincoln would have done. Now, you've all heard of the similarities, or I call the amazing parallels, between Abraham Lincoln and John F. Kennedy. Now, sometimes people say, it's a coincidence, there's a couple of things. There's like a dozen amazing, amazing parallels that exist between the two men, and I'm going to share that with you now. Lincoln's vice president in the second term who became president when he was assassinated, we just said was Andrew Johnson. Kennedy's VP was named Johnson, Lyndon Baines Johnson. Lincoln was elected to Congress in 1846. Kennedy was elected to Congress in 1946. Lincoln's name has 7 letters. Kennedy's name has 7 letters. Lincoln was shot in the head from the back by a Southerner on a Friday. Kennedy was shot in the back of the head, if you believe the official account, by Lee Harvey Oswald, a Southerner, from behind, back of the head, on a Friday. Lincoln had a secretary. The secretary's name was Kennedy. Kennedy's secretary was named Evelyn Lincoln. Before Lincoln went to Ford's Theater the night he was shot, April 14, 1865, his secretary told him, "Don't go." When Kennedy went to Dallas on that fateful day, his secretary, Evelyn Lincoln, asked him not to go to Dallas. Apparently they had bad feelings about this. Andrew Johnson, Lincoln's vice president, was born in 1808. Lyndon Baines Johnson was born 1908. Each person, Lincoln and Kennedy, their wives, lost a child while living at the White House. Booth, John Wilkes Booth, was born in 1839. Lee Harvey Oswald was born in 1939. Each man was known by 3 names: John Wilkes Booth, Lee Harvey Oswald. That's how they were known. Even though I have a middle name, I'm not known as Philip John Giacino. I'm known as Philip Giacino. I use a middle initial. Sometimes when I'm signed as a notary, I have to use my middle name. But those 3 men were known by those 3 names. John Wilkes Booth was killed before trial, fleeing from a warehouse, and he went to a theater. Lee Harvey Oswald was killed on TV before trial, and Oswald fled from a warehouse, the Texas School Book Depository, to a theater where he was captured. Amazing. And to top it off, John F. Kennedy once spilled log cabin syrup in his father's Lincoln. That's a joke. Not a very good one. But it's amazing. If you look at this, if someone wrote a screenplay or a TV show or a movie and you put these events in there, they would say it's too unrealistic. Look at it. Look at the dates. 1860, 1960, 1846, 1946. When they were elected to Congress, they both had a Johnson. Each one's secretary had the last name of the other president. It's an amazing, amazing set of coincidences. Does it mean anything? Probably not. But it's interesting to look at that and see the similarities between the 2 men. And just like they had a lot of parallels, they were very, very different. Lincoln was born in his father's log cabin. His father couldn't even sign his own name, Tom Lincoln. He'd sign with an X. Kennedy was born into wealth, as we know. But yet, they each set on a different path, and they achieved the highest office in the United States, the most powerful man on the planet, President of the United States. And they both met with a tragic end, and they left a legacy that to this day we still feel. And another thing, they were both, and this is obvious, they were both very big with civil rights. Kennedy was pushing civil rights legislation that was signed after his death in '64. In fact, in Bruce Hornsby and the Range, there's a song that says, they passed a law in '64. That's when the law was passed. Lincoln obviously was for civil rights. He freed the slaves. That was the centerpiece of his presidency. He kept the country together, but he knew that he had to pass that because he even said he had the War Powers Act. He had certain rights. So he could do certain things during the war. But he was a smart man, a very accomplished attorney. And he knew when the war ended, his war powers could go out the window. And the slaves could be in the same or similar predicament that they were when they were treated as property. But he had to pass the 13th Amendment before the war ended. And again, when I said shenanigans, he had to promise people things. Okay, we're going to make you the postmaster of Tennessee. You're going to vote this way. You're going to vote that way. A great movie, Lincoln, that won, I think it won Best Picture. And Daniel Day-Lewis played Lincoln. Amazing, amazing movie. It's a great movie. Obviously, they took liberties with it, and they probably invented characters that maybe didn't exist. But if you watch that movie, you can see how the Republicans got held together by Lincoln, where the Democrats were never going to vote for the passage of the 13th Amendment, which freed the slaves. Lincoln knew he had to do what he had to do. Might makes right, very Machiavellian. He did what he had to do because he knew that might be the last shot at that time in history to free the slaves. He had to pass an amendment that would survive. Because it's almost like, presidents say, I got a pen and I'm going to just write this, not even a law, a presidential executive order. It was kind of like an executive order. That another president comes along, just like President Trump undid a lot of the executive orders of President Obama. The next president, hopefully another 5 years, who comes in can get rid of Trump's executive orders. But if it's an amendment, it's like a rock. It's like a boulder. That's not going anywhere. And Lincoln, that's his legacy. That's his legacy. Kept the country together, freed the slaves. That's why, like I said, arguably the greatest president that we ever had. I always say George Washington was the greatest American because he won the Revolutionary War and was an excellent president. But Lincoln did an amazing, amazing thing. What I want to talk next about is free speech. Now, free speech can be found in the First Amendment to the Constitution. What are the amendments? Well, the Bill of Rights are the first 10 amendments to the Constitution. First one being freedom of speech, religion, of the press. Right? The second has to do with arms, and you go through the first 10. There are more than 10, but those are very, very important that were enacted and came about, actually, enacted in 1791, but they came about in full force and effect in 1792, only a few years after the Constitution itself was written. And the framers of the Constitution understood that the Constitution was a great work of art, a great document, but it needed fine-tuning, and that's what they did. And free speech is the bedrock of the Bill of Rights, number one. Can't stress that enough. The First Amendment, the most important amendment. Now, just to go over it again, the First Amendment talks about government can make no law abridging the establishment of religion or prohibiting the free speech or exercise thereof, no law or abridging freedom of speech, of the press, and the right to peaceably assemble. This could be certain restrictions placed, but they're allowed. You can get a couple of people stand in a corner and espouse your position. That's allowed. Try to do that in China, Russia, forget about it. You'll be in the gulag or you'll be dead. And the right to petition the government to redress grievances. You can sue the government. You have to follow the rules, but you can sue the government when you feel the government has wronged you. Now, other countries, that's a foreign concept. Think about it. Now, even freedom of the press, freedom of religion, go to North Korea and start a newspaper and talk, ill of the chairman, who's a dictator in North Korea. Talk bad about him. See where that gets you. We'll go to Russia and talk about Putin. We'll go to China and do those kinds of things. You'll never last. Look what happened even in Hong Kong, which was under their Chinese control. What's happening, what happened like last summer, and some of the things that are going on there when they tried to exercise their free speech. Water cannons or worse. We might not even know everything that went on there, but many people were jailed, beaten up, some were killed. So in America, we take freedom of speech very, very seriously. Remember that, I won't even say her name, but the red-headed comedian who in effigy held up the severed head of President Trump. She wasn't arrested. She wasn't banished. It might have hurt her career, and that's fine. There are consequences for what you do, what you say. So again, you can say whatever you want to say. That doesn't mean you're going to be able to do it without any kind of consequence. Like the kneeling football player. Right? He knelt. He ended up losing his job. That might not have been the reason, but no team wanted to touch him. He got a nice fat Nike contract. But there are consequences. I use the example, if someone works for me and they come into work one day and they have a swastika anywhere on their body, I'm not going to tolerate that. I'm not going to have that in my office, and I could say to them, sorry. Now, I'm not the government, so I'm not abridging or limiting their free expression of speech. But they don't get to work for me. So maybe they want to go to some other place where they can have a swastika or whatever. Free speech also is extended to college campuses. Now, a private school can keep people out. Say, we're not going to give you a forum. A public school, Suffolk Community College, Stony Brook University, that's paid by the taxpayers. Now, that doesn't mean they have to give everybody a forum, but people are allowed to speak there. And they shouldn't say, all right, we're only going to have conservatives speak here, or liberals. Now, liberals, and I'm going to say it, liberals are great for trying to limit the speech of conservatives. You see it all the time. A conservative goes and speaks at a university, and they're shouted down. Whereas when a liberal speaks, the conservatives have better things to do. Maybe they don't show up. Maybe they do show up and they sit there like a lady or a gentleman, and that's fine. But I'll give you a perfect example. Years ago, I was the president of Fordham University's chapter of the Republican Law Students Association. Right? That was a very well-respected old organization at Fordham University. I became its president my senior year. And at that time, Jesse Jackson was going to speak at Fordham University, the undergrad. I also went to Fordham Law, but this was when I was at college. And we met up at Keating Hall, which looks like a castle. We met there, myself and, I don't know, maybe 10, 15 of the members of my organization. And we walked over to where Jesse Jackson was speaking. And we sat down. We kind of went in the back. We didn't get the greatest seats. We got there a little late, but we sat down in the same room where he was, and we listened to what he had to say. We didn't protest. We didn't throw a shoe at him. I didn't have a sign. I didn't mock him. I was a perfect gentleman. And the people that were with me were well-mannered as well. Because if they weren't, I would have said, you know what? Maybe you should sit somewhere else because you're embarrassing the organization that I'm the president of. And I wouldn't tolerate that. You want to, after the, if the media was there and you want to speak and give your opinion as to what he had to say, perfect. Let the man speak. I disagreed with probably 90% of what that man said. But we heard what he had to say. It's called free speech. I respect that. I adhere to that. Let the man have his say. If it was a woman, let her have her say. Doesn't mean I have to agree with it. But that's America. That's the beauty of America. I'm on Facebook. If you know me, I'm prolific on Facebook. In fact, my future son-in-law calls me Facebook Phil. And I do it in a, for lack of a better term, a gentlemanly way. Right? I don't call people names. I stick to the issues. Right? I could, if I ever said anything, call somebody a fool or something like that, I could probably count on one hand the times I've done that. And I usually don't say they're a fool, I say that's foolish conduct. Or I'll be critical, very critical of politicians. I go after Bernie Sanders all the time because of his socialist views. But I back up what I have to say, and I always invite dissent. I always say any comments, or one of the things people like when I say, state your case. Say why you disagree. I'm not going to unfriend you. Now, if you start cursing out, let's say, other people that have an opinion, that I don't like. Or calling them names. It's not necessary. You don't have to do that. But free speech is the bedrock of the Bill of Rights. We have a right to speak. And that's very important. Think about it. What other country could you stand on a street corner and say, President Trump is a blankety blank? Where? Imagine doing that to Putin, or doing that in China or North Korea, or I don't know, maybe even England. Maybe you won't get away with it in England. If you stood up on a street corner and said, the Queen is evil. I don't know what would happen to you. You might not be able to say it. There are rules in those kinds of countries, or countries in general. They don't have free speech like we know it. Right? Even like France, they have these rules, and if there's a trial, you can't speak out. No, we have a right. That's why when Roger Stone had a gag order, that wasn't right. He couldn't speak. That's how he makes his living, speaking. So to say you can't speak, in general, that's wrong. Well, he has a right. If you're charged with a crime, why can't you stand on the street corner and say, I didn't commit that crime? And if you have any evidence to come forward, like OJ, I didn't commit it. It might have been this guy, it might have been that guy, I'm still looking for the person. Free speech. And the way you combat speech you disagree with is not to shout it down. More speech. So you say something, then I get to say something too. And our country, years and years ago, we had, when I was little, we had 4 or 5 stations. There's a news program. Remember Walter Cronkite or somebody like that would come on. Now our news cycle is, every 10 minutes something happens, breaking news. So right now, if there was a shooting on that corner, it would be in the news immediately, somewhere, especially the cable news, or Channel 12 at some point when they run their 8 cycles. But Fox News would pick it up, CNN if it's a big story, CNN, or the president was shot or something like that. Remember when Lincoln was shot, you didn't have cameras or anything like that. People had to read about it in the newspaper. When Kennedy was shot, you didn't have cable news network that right away had somebody there, just like when a little kid falls down a well. You get the Chinese media, everybody comes if it's a big story, and they make it a big story. Right? And then you had video cameras a little bit, you had the Zapruder film, and you had some others that they found out later, but it wasn't a very, very well photographed event when Kennedy was assassinated. Nowadays, everybody that has a cell phone, has a smartphone, has a camera. So think about it today. If Donald Trump was coming out down this street, people would have their camcorder, or not camcorder, listen to me, they'd have their cell phones out, and they'd be videotaping and taking photographs all over the place. People with a cop makes an arrest nowadays. And what do you see? Some person is right there, might be a friend of the defendant, and is taping it to make sure the cop doesn't overstep his bounds. There's body cameras. That camera's on my house. It's outside, inside. You can't move a muscle where you're not going to be picked up somewhere. There's satellites. In fact, I heard satellite imagery, I think it was Google Earth, found a person who had died years ago because I guess the water was shallow at that moment, and they saw the outline of a car. I think it was a red car. And somebody said, wait a minute, it looks like a car's in that water. It was a pond or a lake, a small lake. And because of the imagery, which didn't exist years ago, they were able to find that person and give closure to the family because they didn't know what happened to the person. They drove off a road and they died. They were in that car. The remains were found in that car. So it's amazing how far America has come. But again, back to free speech. I digress. Very, very important. And it's especially important when it comes to politics. Because we want to elect a president that individually we believe in. We want to be able to say things about that president, good or bad. If it's someone like I want to speak against some of the policies of Barack Obama, I can do that. Or Joe Biden, who's running for the presidency as a Democrat. Or Bloomberg will be out, if he hasn't dropped out already. I think he might have suspended his campaign. But him. Or Elizabeth Warren, I don't think she's dropped out yet. Or Bernie Sanders, a socialist. We can make those arguments. It's great in this country that we're allowed to do that. It's important. We can do it on social media. People always say, I wish Trump would stop tweeting. He knows, for the most part, that the media is against him. He calls it fake news, but the media is against President Trump. Even Fox News he has some issues with. He's not a big fan of everybody. He likes Hannity and Tucker, and there's some he doesn't like. And he'll even say that. He's like, they're okay, Fox News. So how does he get to the American people? Twitter. Facebook, he doesn't really Facebook, but Twitter. That's his. I use Facebook. He likes Twitter. Remember FDR with the fireside chats. He would go out on the airwaves and people with a radio could hear what he had to say. It was called fireside chat. That was the equivalent of Twitter nowadays because it's unfunneled, uncensored. He can say just about whatever he wants. Now, we might not agree with what he says, but that's okay. I don't know anybody on this planet that I agree with 100%. Even people that, my dad and I agree on most issues. I don't know really the last time we disagreed on something, but that's possible. Or I have a friend who's very conservative, but in fact, he and I used to do a show together. And he thought maybe a little more centralized education. And I thought, let the states, or more states' rights. We're both conservative guys. We both agree on many things. But I felt I didn't like the Department of Education, the federal level. I said it can be done, get rid of that over time maybe, and have the states. Who knows better than what Missouri needs or what Minnesota needs? Missouri, Minnesota, and even more locally, Long Island. Long Island is different than New York City. They have different needs. They have a different population. In the city, you might have fabulous wealth in certain schools or poverty in others. In Long Island, it might be more middle class. And some bureaucrat in Washington might not really understand that. Remember Common Core? What a disaster. That was some bureaucrat in Washington. That wasn't some local person. My kids go to Three Village, went to Three Village years ago. And Three Village should be able to a large extent, do what they feel is necessary. Now, the governor of a state, even the governor is removed a bit, because Governor Cuomo, he might not know what's best for Three Village, or what's best for Harlem, or what's best for Schenectady. But those particular towns do. Yes, there should be accountability, but why have a bloated bureaucracy and have the Department of Education? You don't need it. They should phase it out at some point. But my friend and I, and my co-host at one time, disagreed on that. But we talked about it on the air. So these are perfect examples of people being allowed to say what they feel, what they think, what they would like to see happen. I'm on Facebook all the time. Sometimes I'm attacked, not too bad, but someone will disagree and say, how could you believe that? Or how could you support Trump? Or how could you feel this way about something? That's okay. And come back at me. And then I have my say, and that's how it goes. Now, I've had success at changing people's minds. And I think maybe my mind was changed once or twice when other facts came out, let's say a particular story. Maybe not about ideology, but I've done posts, and people will say something, and I said, you know what? I disagree for this reason. And someone says, you know what? You convinced me. Sometimes they come on strong, and I believe you now, or I agree with you 100%, or I'll take another look at it. And that's fine. But when President Trump tweets, he's never going to change. Some people say, I wish he would. Don't even wish that. It is not going to happen. President Trump will be tweeting until the last day that he is president. 2024. He's going to be tweeting and tweeting. He tweets in his sleep. I don't think the guy sleeps, but he does. He's a prolific tweeter. And that's okay. And, there's an expression, remember where Manny Ramirez, when he was winning World Series with the Red Sox, oh, that's just Manny being Manny. Okay, that's fine. That's the way he conducted himself. And if he was winning World Series, the fans really didn't care. It's just like if you support Biden, he's a gaffe machine. The things he comes out with is amazing when you hear him speak. He gets the Constitution confused. He said, that thing, that thing. He's running for presidency. I think he's 77, 76. But still, you have to be alert. Now, we all have moments where we forget something or we say something inaccurately. And like if you watch Hannity or those guys, if they make a mistake, there's some little thing in their ear, an earpiece, when a producer is going to say, no, that's not the case. And they correct them. When you're on the trail and someone sticks a mic in your face, you might make a mistake. Sure, Trump has made mistakes and said things that are not accurate. I remember Barack Obama, President Obama, said something about 57 states. And they said, well, he meant, American possessions. We all know there's 50 states. He made a mistake. I cut him a little slack. But then cut my guy some slack. I know Obama's not dumb, and he knows there are 50. At that moment, he made a mistake. Just like if Trump makes a mistake and people jump all over it. Now, Biden's a different story because that guy is a perennial gaffe machine. Always, always, always. But again, to a large extent, those kinds of things, the expression, it's baked in. It's like if you buy a stock, it might be baked in that something negative is going to happen, so people understand that. So when that happens, they're okay. They don't panic. Right? Just like with Trump. If tomorrow some woman came out and said, President Trump did this to me or said that to me, it wouldn't make a difference. It's baked in. When you heard him say, I grabbed women by the you-know-what, right? Whether he was joking or not, he said it, and that didn't hurt him. Because people accept people for who they are. Now, remember years ago, you had like a Gary Hart, and all of a sudden it came out that he had a girlfriend. That was the end of his candidacy. Or a candidate says something ridiculous. That could be the end of their candidacy. I forget who it was. It was a Republican. It said, then we're going to go to here, we're going to go yeehaw. And people looked at the guy like, he's a nut. And his candidacy was over. Because that was, I guess, a shock. That wasn't baked in. If that's what the guy was always going around doing, it would have been like, okay. Just like when Biden says something ridiculous. Super Thursday, or 150 million people were killed by guns, whatever. 150,000. Not 150. If 150 million, that'd be half the country would be dead. But he says that a lot. But again, it's baked in. Just like when Trump says something, people say, oh my God. Like when he calls people names. And I don't like that. He'll say Mini Mike, or Small Hands, or lying this, or Pocahontas, or whatever. It's funny, you laugh at it. He's a comedian. He's funnier than most comedians on TV. I joked one time, I said, I don't have to watch Chappelle, Dave Chappelle. Trump was on. And he's funny. And then he ducks, so it looks like he's shrinking, like Mike Bloomberg behind the podium. And it's funny. And you laugh, but is that really nice? No. But that's him. He brands people. Nobody can brand him. People have tried. Oh, Lion Trump or this or that. Doesn't stick. He says something, Lion Ted Cruz, who now is a conservative and maybe he'll be president someday. He'll go to his grave being known as Lying Ted, even if you don't think for 1 second he's a liar. Because he was branded that way. Just like when Trump had The Apprentice, he branded people. He branded his name. Could be water, it could be steaks, could be a football league, the XFL, or his buildings. He branded things. And when he got to politics, it was no different. He branded people. Lion Ted, Little Marco, Mini Mike, Pocahontas. Those people will go to their graves with that moniker. No question. 20 years from now, if Mike Bloomberg is still alive, I don't know about that, but if he's still alive, and you say Mike Bloomberg, you're Mini Mike, even if you don't like that, or Lion Ted, or Elizabeth Warren will forever be known as Pocahontas. 10 years from now, if he runs for presidency in 4 years, 8 years, whatever, you're going to think Pocahontas. You might not say it. You're going to think that because he branded them. He gave them all nicknames. That's amazing. That's why I firmly believe that he will be reelected on November 3rd, 2020. Because I can't imagine any of the Democrats. It's really a two-man race now. It's just Biden and Bernie Sanders. Neither one can match up to Trump. First of all, who in their right mind would vote for a socialist? It ain't going to happen. Now, the election, the primaries, Super Tuesday was the other day, and Biden did well. Bernie redeemed himself by winning California, so it's a horse race. But if you vote for a socialist, you have to have your head examined. Can't do that. History teaches us, Venezuela, Cuba, we're not going to become a socialist country. If we are, we're in trouble. Biden, don't be fooled. He's a liberal. They call him the moderate. When you talk about free education, and when you talk about raising taxes, those kinds of things, how can you call yourself a moderate? John F. Kennedy lowered taxes. He was a Democrat. Not the kind of Democrat you see today. He'd be rolling in his grave if he heard that a socialist was in the lead for a while and is just about neck and neck and could still get the nomination. But look up Biden. He's called the moderate. No. He's still, for all intents and purposes, a liberal politician. Not as liberal as Bernie, but still not as, let's say, moderate as a Bill Clinton. Bill Clinton was moderate. I don't believe that Biden would govern as a moderate. I don't. I think the whole Democrat Party has changed tremendously. I had this debate with my son maybe a couple of weeks ago, where I said, it concerns me. And I know that not every Democrat believes in socialism. I know that. A lot of them don't. That's why Bernie Sanders didn't do well in the southern states. Biden did. But don't kid yourself. Those states, like Alabama, Arkansas, Biden's not going to win those in a general election. No way. Those are going to Trump, or any conservative Republican that would run. They're going to go to Trump, those southern states. Just like with the Reagan Democrats. Remember when Reagan won the presidency, 80, 84, he won 49 states, except Minnesota, that Mondale won, Mondale's home state. Pretty amazing feat. I'll never see that in my lifetime, Republican winning 49 states. You know how I know? California, New York, very liberal states. They have conservative enclaves, or at least moderate. Long Island, I wouldn't call this a liberal bastion. But you go to New York City, you go to this Albany, you go to the city centers. Liberal, liberal, liberal. Liberal poor, liberal rich. Middle class is not as well represented, let's say, in Manhattan. Poor and rich. Some middle class. But Long Island, mostly middle class. Upper middle, lower middle, middle class. So that's why I believe President Trump will win. I predicted in 2016, even before the primaries were over, because I could see it. Now, people called me crazy back then, and now they're not calling me as crazy. They're just saying, well, wait a minute. Biden could win, and he's more moderate. If you want to do a 180 with an excellent, excellent economy, vote for the Democrat. Do you want to do a 180? Do you want to take that chance? Where certain socialist policies, it could be universal income, universal health care, higher taxes. Biden has already said it. Do your homework. Look it up. I'm not making this up. What I say are facts. You can take it to the bank. When it's an opinion, I say it's my opinion. It's a fact. Biden said he wants to raise taxes. Maybe not as much as Sanders would do, but I always say pick your poison. Well, that poison is not as bad as that poison, so I'm going to go with that poison. Why pick your poison? Stay with someone that gave you an excellent economy. Right? But do your homework. Vote for who you think you should see in that office. Right? One last thing. It's a kind of a pet peeve. I despise early voting. Despise it. I don't think it should exist. Now, if you're away, you can do an absentee ballot. I'm not talking about that. I was in Florida one time for an election, and I did by absentee ballot. That's different. Early voting, I think, is the most stupid thing that exists. Think about it. It almost hurt Biden to a large extent because he had a big bump in South Carolina. But some of those states, and maybe even California being one of them, or Texas, although he did win Texas, early voting. So I'll give you an example. Let's say Super Tuesday was yesterday. Let's say the day before Tuesday, Monday, a candidate did something shocking. Wouldn't you want, if you're one of the voters, especially in a primary, wouldn't you want to have your vote in your pocket to be able to say, okay, I can't believe what that guy did. I'm going to vote for this guy, calling an audible in the voting booth. But if you can vote a month, weeks, 2 months, whatever, before, I always say I like to keep my powder dry until I'm ready to pull that trigger. When you know. So even when after a while, I was sure I was going to vote for Trump in the primary. It didn't really matter. It was New York. But I still would like to hold my vote until the last possible moment. Because what if the guy does something that I just can't accept? And I say, I'm going to vote for somebody else. Right? Absentee ballots are different. Okay. Enough of politics. What I want to discuss briefly in the last 7 or so minutes was called frequently asked legal questions. These are questions that come up frequently in my practice. You know, Mr. Producer, put up my book. Now, today I'm going to be discussing criminal law. I wrote a book called Divorce: A Practical Guide, chock full of information. It's a good read. It'll give you information. I call it soup to nuts. What to do before, during, and after your divorce. A lot of information. If you want also additional information, you go to my website, JussinoLaw.com. One frequently asked question I get, or something that came up today, where people say, what does that mean? Adjournment in contemplation of dismissal. This is criminal law now, not divorce or family law. Criminal law. What is an ACOD, adjournment in contemplation of dismissal? If you're charged with a crime, the most common ACODs are given out involving petty larcenies and unlawful possession of marijuana, sometimes criminal possession as well. You're charged with a crime or a violation of law. In petty larceny, it's a crime. It's a misdemeanor. You take a class, stop lift, you go back to court, you have to get an attorney because it's a misdemeanor, and you are given what they call an ACOD. So in court, the judge says, do you understand what an ACOD is? Yes. So the attorney makes the application pursuant to 170-55, criminal procedure law, or 156 if it has to do with pot, marijuana. And the person doesn't have to make any admission. They don't have to acknowledge any guilt. They don't have to pay a fine. If they have to attend a class, they pay for the class. And the judge says, okay, 6 months from today if it's a petty larceny, a year from today if it's marijuana, and you walk out of the courtroom and these people are like, that's it? It's it. It's not probation. It is not, you don't go to jail. There's no supervision. It's nothing. What's the catch? You cannot get in trouble. I'm not talking about a speeding ticket or something like that. Any criminal charge or anything that would bring you to a criminal court. So another petty larceny, you bet. It's going to come back. A DWI, probably, especially if it's another DWI. But if you have a petty larceny DWI, they don't have to bring it back. It's up to the DA. An assault, those kinds of things, the case will probably come back. Now, when I say come back, what does that mean? It means that you got an ACOD before, it comes back. You're not guilty of it, but the DA could say, it's back. I want you to plead guilty now to a misdemeanor or a violation. You lost the ACOD. Usually you get one ACOD. There's no law that says that, but usually the DA is not going to give you a second ACOD. It happens, but it's not that common. So that's what an ACOD is. Stay out of trouble. There still could be an order of protection with it. I've had cases where we shorten the period. I had a guy going into the military. Now think about it. The case, it's an adjournment in contemplation of dismissal. The case is still technically pending. So if you want to go to boot camp and join the Army, the Marines, Air Force, you can't with an ACOD pending because the case is pending. They will not take you. If you pled to a violation, like a disorderly conduct or harassment, they can take you. So I had a case one time, we shortened the ACOD. The DA's got to agree, and the judge has to agree. But it was a worthy reason. The guy was going to join the Army. And we had proof. It wasn't like, yeah, I want to join the Army. Okay, we'll give you a week ACOD or a day ACOD. It really doesn't make much of a difference. If it's a day, it'll be over the next day. But that's what they can do in certain cases. Along the lines of an ACOD, it's not, but it's along the lines of an alternate way to resolve a case. What is interim probation? Now, regular probation is when you take a plea, so you could go to jail and then be on probation, or to avoid jail, you're placed on probation. Probation, 1 year, be misdemeanor, 3 years for an A misdemeanor, 5 years for a felony, 10 years for a sex offense. That's probation. And at the end of the probationary period, the charge is not dropped or changed. So if you pled to a DOE, 3 years probation, at the end of the 3 years, you still have that conviction. You're off probation, but you still have the conviction. Interim probation is an alternate way to resolve the case. You still got to get the permission of the judge. You have to get the permission of the DA. And I'll give you an example. So let's say you're charged with an assault. And normally you can be placed on 3 years probation. You have no priors. Maybe the case is not the world's strongest case, or you're a choir boy and you just did something you shouldn't have done. Interim probation will allow you to take the plea, let's say to the misdemeanor, assault third, do 1 year probation. At the end of the probationary period, the case gets knocked down to a violation. So you get rewarded for doing well on 1 year probation. Like if you're young and they don't want to saddle you with a crime, you take the plea and you do 1 year interim probation. You still have a probation officer. It's still probation, but it's called interim because it's not final. And at the end of the year, if you screw up, you're stuck with that charge. So if you pled to the assault third, you go on probation and they do a urine test and you have drugs in your system. Judge could say, sorry, I'm going to put you on another 2 years probation, and you're stuck with that plea. You pled guilty to that charge. I'm not changing it. I want to thank you for watching the show. I said a little while ago I wrote a book called Divorce: A Practical Guide, chock full of information. Every Saturday. Now, most of what I do, in the past anyway, has been law. And I used to have a show, I might be going back to it, on Fridays, which was heavy on politics. I called it Politics, Law, and Social Commentary with an Edge. With this TV show for a while, a long time, I've been doing just law. I'm trying to branch out because I enjoy doing the politics, frequently asked questions, talking about Lincoln and Jefferson and Levi Strauss, I talked a little bit about last week, about capitalism and what he did, or Clara Barton, or how Larry David helped a guy get off of, or potentially get off of death row, who if he was convicted would have been on death row. Thank you for watching the show. Next Saturday, 10 a.m., tune in again, Finding Common Ground. I'm Phil Jusino. Have a good day.